You believe that children are being abused by pedophiles in Hollywood.
Absolutely.
So why are you sitting down talking to me? Why aren't you sitting down with the police right now?
I've told the police. In fact, if anybody wants to go back to 1993 when I was interviewed by the Santa Barbara Police Department, I sat there and I gave them the names. They're on record. They have all of this in
thinking, I'm paranoid. I imagined that stuff. That couldn't be the reason for why so-and-so was acting like. Could it? And then you find out later on the track that you are exactly on track with a lot of
human hunting. And when a mind control slave such as myself was stripped of clothes and turned loose in the woods, I was then hunted by George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Bill Clinton.
There are people that were the people that did this to both me and Corey that are still working. They're still out there, and they're some of the richest, most powerful people in this business.
And they are.
And they do not want me saying what I'm saying right now.
Are you saying that they're pedophiles?
Yes.
And that they're still in...
Have you ever watched an old interview and suddenly felt like it aged a little too well? Like someone said something years ago, everybody laughed it off, called him crazy, cancelled him. And then decades later the internet goes back, replays the clip, and says, wait, hold on, what did he just say? Because that's exactly what's happening right now with Mel Gibson. A man Hollywood once labeled as unstable, problematic, finished. A man who, back in the 90s, talked about strange things in the industry that made people deeply uncomfortable. And now, after the Epstein case, after the headlines, after the documentaries, after Sound of Freedom, people are digging up those old clips and asking a very awkward question. Was Mel Gibson seeing something the rest of us refuse to see? Why are his old words suddenly trending again? Why are people connecting a movie about child trafficking to conversations nobody in Hollywood likes to have? And why does this feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern nobody wants to talk about? This is not about accusations. This is about timing. And timing can be very revealing. So here's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because when people went back and rewatched those old Mel Gibson interviews from the late 90s, they didn't hear a man making wild claims. They heard a man describing a feeling, a vibe, an atmosphere in Hollywood that didn't sit right with him. He never pointed fingers. He never named names. But he kept repeating one thing. There were things I saw that I couldn't explain, and nobody wanted to explain them to me either. At the time, audiences brushed it off as paranoia. The media framed it as another example of Mel being Mel. Hollywood quietly distanced itself. Studios stopped calling. Invitations stopped coming. Doors that were once wide open suddenly felt locked. And for years, that's how the story stayed. Until the internet did what the internet does best. It remembered. Clips resurfaced. Old interviews got millions of views. Comment sections turned into detective boards. People weren't laughing anymore. They were listening, very carefully. Because now, with everything the public has learned in recent years about powerful people, secretive circles, and crimes hiding behind wealth and status, those vague comments from decades ago don't sound so vague anymore. They sound eerie. And that's when people started connecting dots that may or may not be there, but the timing made it impossible to ignore. Then comes The Passion of the Christ. A movie Mel had to fund himself because, according to him, no studio wanted to touch it. A massive risk. A personal gamble. And somehow, against all expectations, it became one of the most successful independent films of all time. Hollywood didn't celebrate. It tolerated. And then, years later, another film enters the picture, Sound of Freedom. Different story, different lead actor, different time. But a theme that hit a nerve worldwide, child trafficking. The film sparked conversations that people usually avoid. It made viewers uncomfortable. It brought a dark subject into mainstream discussion. And suddenly, Mel Gibson's name was back in headlines. Not for scandals, but for support of a film that most studios reportedly passed on. That's when the online speculation machine went into overdrive. People began asking, why did this topic keep following Mel? Why did he keep circling back to stories that most of Hollywood seemed hesitant to tell? And why did his old interviews start feeling like puzzle pieces from a picture we're only now trying to understand? Again, no accusations. No direct links. Just questions that refuse to go away. Because the more you look at the timeline, the stranger it feels. A young actor in the 90s saying Hollywood felt off. A filmmaker in the 2000s struggling to get backing for a religious film. A veteran figure in the 2020s associated with a movie about trafficking that shook audiences worldwide. Individually, these are separate events. Together, they create a narrative that the internet cannot stop talking about. And here's the part that really fuels the fire. For years, Mel Gibson was portrayed as the villain of Hollywood. The difficult one. The controversial one. The man studios didn't want to be associated with. But now, in comment sections and reaction videos, a different tone is emerging. People aren't asking, what's wrong with Mel? They are asking, what did Mel see? And that shift, that subtle, uncomfortable shift, is what makes this story impossible to ignore. Because when public perception flips after decades, it's rarely random. It's usually triggered by something bigger happening in the background. Something that forces people to revisit old stories with new eyes. And whether coincidence or not, Mel Gibson's old words are being replayed at the exact moment the world is having conversations Hollywood never wanted to have in the first place. And just when you think this is all coincidence, the internet does what it always does. It starts digging. Old photos. Old interviews. Old red carpet clips. Panel discussions nobody cared about at the time. Suddenly, everything is being re-watched like it's evidence in a courtroom drama. Not because anyone proved anything, but because the context around these clips has changed. People began noticing how often certain topics made others visibly uncomfortable in interviews. How quickly conversations were redirected. How jokes were made to deflect serious questions. How some subjects were treated like forbidden territory in an industry that usually has no problem talking about anything. And that's where the speculation picked up speed. Comment sections started filling with the same type of remarks. Why did he sound so uneasy back then? Why did nobody ask follow-up questions? Why was this treated like nonsense at the time? It wasn't what was said. It was how people reacted when it was said. And that's what gave this whole story a second life. Because now, viewers aren't watching those clips as entertainment. They are watching them like investigators. Then comes the role of Sound of Freedom in all this. A film that, on the surface, is simply a thriller based on the fight against trafficking. But online, people started treating it like more than a movie. They treated it like a statement. A message. A spotlight being pointed toward something most entertainment avoids. And when Mel publicly supported the film, the timeline suddenly looked interesting. Not suspicious. Not proven. Just interesting. A man who once said Hollywood felt strange. A film about a subject Hollywood rarely touches. A public already shaken by real-world headlines involving powerful people and criminal behavior. You can see why minds started connecting dots. Fairly or unfairly. And the more people talked about it, the more the narrative grew legs of its own. Reaction channels started popping up. Podcasts began analyzing decades-old footage. Social media threads with millions of views broke down expressions, pauses, word choices, like they were decoding hidden messages. Was any of it confirmed? No. Did that stop people from talking? Absolutely not. Because once public curiosity locks onto a story like this, it doesn't let go easily. And what really added fuel to the fire was the fact that, for years, Mel Gibson's name was associated with controversy for completely different reasons. Personal scandals, public outbursts, headlines that had nothing to do with any of this. Which made some people wonder, did all of that noise distract from something else he had been trying to say long ago? Or is the internet simply rewriting history to fit a modern narrative? That question alone has kept this topic trending. Because now, it's not just about Mel Gibson. It's about how we, as an audience, decide who to believe, who to dismiss, and how quickly public opinion can flip when the world changes around old stories. And by the time this conversation reached its peak online, something even stranger started happening. People weren't just revisiting Mel Gibson's words anymore. They were revisiting Hollywood itself. Old award show jokes, vintage interviews, behind-the-scenes documentaries, late-night talk show moments that once felt harmless suddenly felt loaded. Not because they proved anything, but because viewers were watching with a completely different mindset than they did 10 or 20 years ago. It was like the audience had changed lenses. Moments that once passed as awkward humor were now being paused, replayed, and discussed in comment sections with thousands of replies. Not as evidence, but as cultural artifacts from a time when certain topics were laughed off instead of examined. And right in the middle of all this rewatching, Mel Gibson's old comments kept resurfacing like a bookmark people forgot they left in a very uncomfortable chapter. Because what he described wasn't specific. It was atmospheric. He talked about a feeling. A vibe. A sense that something behind the scenes didn't match the polished image on screen. And that kind of statement is impossible to disprove, which is exactly why it keeps people talking. Then add Sound of Freedom back into the conversation. A film that arrived at a time when audiences were already more aware, more suspicious, more curious about how power, money, and influence operate in the real world. The movie didn't accuse anyone. It told a story. But the timing of that story landing in theaters made viewers connect it to broader discussions happening outside the cinema. And once again, Mel's name was sitting quietly nearby. Not shouting. Not accusing. Just present in the conversation. Which made some people wonder if this was coincidence stacked on coincidence, or if certain topics have simply followed him throughout his career in a way that now feels impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Hollywood stayed mostly silent. No big rebuttals. No official statements. No debates on talk shows. Just the usual cycle of promotion, premieres, and press tours as if none of this online discussion existed. And sometimes, silence makes people even more curious. Because when the internet senses a gap between what's being talked about publicly and what's being discussed privately online, that gap becomes a breeding ground for theories, debates, and endless speculation. So now, years after those interviews were first recorded, Mel Gibson's words are traveling farther than they ever did when he originally said them. Not because he's repeating them, but because the audience is. And now the question isn't what Mel Gibson meant back then. The real question is why so many people are listening now. Why are decades-old interviews trending like breaking news? Why are movie clips, red carpet moments, and forgotten talk show appearances being replayed like they contain hidden messages? And why does it feel like the audience is doing more investigating than the industry ever did? Maybe this is all coincidence. Maybe the internet is connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. Or maybe, just maybe, timing has a strange way of making old words sound brand new. Because whether you agree with the speculation or roll your eyes at it, one thing is undeniable. People are paying attention in a way they never did before. They are questioning narratives. They are revisiting the past with fresh eyes. They are asking uncomfortable questions about power, influence, and what gets talked about versus what gets ignored. And sitting quietly at the center of this renewed curiosity is Mel Gibson, a man who, years ago, said Hollywood felt strange and moved on with his life. But the internet didn't move on. So what do you think? Is this just social media overanalyzing old clips for entertainment? Or do those old interviews really hit different after everything we've learned in recent years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know where you stand on this. And if you enjoy deep dives into the stories, moments, and interviews that people are suddenly looking at in a whole new light, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because sometimes, the most interesting stories aren't the new ones. They are the old ones we finally start listening to.